Um, I know a lot of you in the room, but if I don't know you, my name is Lilly. I am our student ministries resident right now at Pathway. I also have a sophomore girls small group, so shout out to them. I love being here with you guys. I spend most of my time with middle school students, actually. This is actually my first time getting to speak for high school, so it's super exciting, and I'm just thankful to be a part of it and just to be with you guys. Speaking of my sophomore girls small group who I love, I actually met a large majority of them at Raft Trip this past summer, and I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you guys were at Raft Trip this past summer? Yeah? Okay, so a good amount of you. I'm sure you guys have heard of Raft Trip, even if you weren't there. It is so much fun. It's absolutely unhinged. Lots of crazy things happen at Raft Trip. Lots of injuries, but lots of learning about the Lord. And I have a story for you guys about Raft Trip from this past summer, if you're willing to hear what I have to say on that. But, like I said, lots of activities. Usually we whitewater raft. Some people do high ropes. There's rappelling and caving. And at some point during Raft Trip, everyone who's there goes in a group to the state park in West Virginia called Babcock. And if you've been to Babcock, you know that it is quite the hike. And it's a lot of fun, but it's chaos. And this past summer when I was there, I was in the third group, so we went on the very last day. And when you go to Babcock, you spend a lot of time at the top, just kind of we do some tog and just some activities together. And then you hike down, and when you get to the bottom, there's a river that has lots of rocks and it's almost like some places are almost like waterfalls, but they're small, and we just spend a lot of time climbing on all the rocks and just exploring, and it's a lot of fun. Well, this summer, when we went on the third day, what we didn't realize was that it had rained that night, and the water levels had rose. And so if you were there the third day, you may remember how crazy it was. And I was there, and as kids are climbing on all the rocks, we were like, okay, we need to protect them. It's a little scary. And so we're climbing, and I'm with Sav, and we're trying to help all these students get across the river, and I'm standing on one side, and I'm standing on a rock, and I'm 5'2". It's not like my arm length is really going to help people that much. But I'm standing, holding this rock, and I'm reaching, and we're telling students to jump. Guys, I have to take this earring out. It's clicking, and I'm sure it's bothering you guys. I'm so sorry. It's bothering me. Okay. Anyways, I'm helping kids cross the river, and they're jumping into the river, and I'm grabbing their hands, and I'm pulling them in, and we're going to the other side. And so we spend time doing this over and over, and you kind of had to jump at an angle so that way when the water pushed you, you didn't get pushed too far back. And so we get all the students across, and then we're all hanging out, and finally Sav and I are like, okay, probably time to go. And so we start to think, how are we going to get back? Because what we realized was that if the students jumped back, they would just go right past it because the flow of the river. So me and Sav were just sitting there well, not sure how these kids are going to get back without going for a swim. So we're kind of freaking out a little bit, and we see this tree that has fallen, and it's landed on these big boulders. And so Sav and I are perfect. So we go up, and the river is flowing right through our legs. And we're standing on a rock this big, and it's super slippery, and we have one foot here, and my foot's planted, Sav's doing the same thing. We're sharing a rock, and our back is leaning up against this giant tree that has fallen. And so the river is just going right underneath us, and we're terrified. And so we're helping students get across. And I'm so curious if any of you guys remember this, if you were there, but whoever was there, you had to crawl across us. Literally, we were holding students, trying to bring them across. And at one point, a student steps on the rock and slips and falls. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like we're gonna lose a kid at Babcock. Like we can't do this. Like, and this kid starts going underneath Sav's legs. And I forgot to mention that I had just found out Sav was pregnant. And students didn't know yet. And so I'm in the river and I'm like, if this kid falls and Sav falls, Sav's pregnant, and I can't tell that kid to let go of her because I can't tell them why. And so I'm like, of course they're gonna like gravitate toward her. She's like 6 feet tall and 5'2". They're like, yeah, you're helpless. Okay. So I'm like trying to help. And so I'm holding on to Sav and I'm like, please don't fall, please don't fall. And she like grabs the other kid and I reach down to grab their armpit and pull him up. And like we somehow get everyone across and nobody died at Babcock and it was a great time. But it was very scary. And when we got back, we were trying to explain how it was just like chaos. But of course, like I said, I can't tell students that it was so chaotic because I knew that Sav was pregnant. And I was like, why are you in the river to begin with? But we know it's Sav, she's gonna do it anyway. And so I couldn't explain that. And on top of it, all the other groups who had already went were like, it was fine yesterday, we did it all the time, and it was fun. And I'm like, yeah, but guys, the water levels rose, you just don't get it. And then we just kept saying the famous, you had to have been there. You just had to have been there. And we all know what that's like, right? When you have an experience in your life that was just crazy, and you're trying to explain, and people just don't get it. They're like, yeah, whatever. And you're like, no, like, hear me. It was so cool, or it was so scary. And then we're just like, I guess you just had to have been there. And I really just love this series that we're in because we're looking at the life of Jesus. And as we look at the life of Jesus, we're discovering that so many times in the things that we experience, Jesus also gets it because he's been there. And we're focusing on Hebrews 4:15 that says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And I don't know where all of you guys are at in the room tonight. And maybe some of you, it's your first time and you're maybe not sure about the whole Jesus thing. And maybe some of you have been coming here and you're all in and you've known the Lord for a long time. But wherever you guys fall, we hope that through this series, you recognize, maybe even for the first time, that Jesus isn't someone who looks down on us with confusion when it comes to the things that we go through. But he actually gets on our level and in every way can say, I too have been there. And over the last 2 weeks, we've talked about this. And we've talked about Jesus being in a season of waiting. We've talked about the fact that for 33 years, he had to wait for God to say go on the very thing that he came to earth to do. Last week, we talked about Jesus understanding what it means to be tempted. And we read a story about him being led into the wilderness by the Spirit, and he was tempted over and over and over again by Satan. And now I found it comforting that Jesus can look at my life and my heart and he can say, I've been there, right? Like, thank God someone gets it. But I'm even more thankful that instead of simply leveling with me and understanding where I come from, Jesus actually guides me and gives me direction when it comes to navigating the hard things that life can bring. And so tonight we're going to dive in to another way in which Jesus has been there. And I just want to start by clearing something up, okay? I know many of us would probably never admit to what I'm about to say, and that's probably because it sounds selfish, and if I'm honest, it is selfish. But I think that in order for us to get the most out of tonight's message, that we all need to be on the same page of accepting the truth that we like things to be done our way. Right? We like things to go our way. How many of you like it when things go your way? I'm not saying you always have to have things go your way. I'm saying you like it. It's in your favor when things go your way. It's kind of nice, right? We like for things to be done our way. In fact, I have a story for you guys that really brought this idea to light for me. Just a few weeks ago, my boyfriend Dylan and I were hanging out on a Sunday after church. And if you're anything like me, Sundays are strictly reset days, right? It's like, I got to get things done. I got to prepare for the week ahead. Some of you guys are like, I'm doing my homework on Sunday nights because I blew it off all weekend. But Sundays, reset days. And so instead of going somewhere after church, I was like, hey, Dylan, how about you just come over to my house? Like, I have some things I need to get done. I need a meal prep. I need to finish my laundry. Like, can we just hang out over there? And he's like, sure. So we go over to my house, and we're hanging out in my living room, and I had a list of things I needed to do. And he finally just said, hey, how about you go finish your meal prep for the week, and I'll stay in the living room, and I'll fold the rest of the laundry. And one of the things I love about Dylan is that he always is looking for a way to serve. And it means so much to me that he cares enough to say, hey, I know you have this on your plate, let me help. And so I was like, okay, you know what? Okay. Like, I'll go meal prep. You can help with my laundry. Thank you. And so I go in the kitchen, I get done meal prepping, I'm working on stuff, I get done. I go back in the living room just in time to see Dylan folding a towel. And I'm standing there and I'm just looking at him. And finally I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, folding a towel. And I'm just like, my skin like starts to crawl. I was just like, ew, like who folds a towel like that? And I'm looking at him and I'm like, no. And he's like, I'm just folding a towel. And I pick one up and I unfold it and I'm like, this is how you fold a towel. And I'm like explaining that you have to fold it in half and then you fold it 3 ways down. And he's like, no, like, listen. Whatever, listen. It's long ways. Ladies know what I'm talking about. Moms in the room, you know what I'm talking about. You got to make sure it fits in your closet, right? Listen, I get some thumbs up over here, okay? Listen, you guys can debate this later. You can debate it later. Moral of the story, I told Dylan, I said, listen, my mom taught me how to fold a towel a long time ago, and I'm not wrong. And like, my mom didn't teach me wrong, I promise. And he's like, well, my mom taught me, and this is how she told me to do it. And I'm like, great, we're going to go round and round because neither one of us are going to admit our mom was wrong. Like, you know what that does. And so I was like, okay, like, finally we debate, and I'm just like, you know what? It's okay. I'm not going to argue because you're the one that's folding my laundry, right? Like, I should be thankful that you're doing this. But I did say, I was like, listen, like, if we get married, like, we're going to have a crash course on how to do towel folding because, like, this is not right. Like, okay? But I know Dylan's probably somewhere in the room right now shaking his head, telling me that I'm wrong and y'all are probably right and you guys are all going to be Team Dylan with the towel folding. I get it. But beside the point. Okay. All of this is to reiterate the fact that we like things to go our way. Every single one of us. And I believe that not only do we like for things to be done our way, we like for things to be in our control. And if you're fighting for control in an area of your guys' life, I'm sure that it probably has something to do with something much more important than how you fold your towels. In fact, most of us are fighting for control when it comes to things like our future, our friendships, our circumstances, and our feelings. And we want control in these areas because it makes us feel secure and safe and strong. But I think Jesus would ask us to surrender. And I think that if we look at his life and the places that he has been, we would see so clearly that surrender is not in our human nature. Surrender is something we choose. I think so many of us believe that when we follow Jesus, surrender becomes a natural part of who we are. And while following Jesus might increase our desire to surrender, I believe that the fallen condition of our hearts still causes us to want things our way. In fact, when we really aren't careful, I believe that many of us can end up living a life that we want while telling ourselves that it's the life God wants for us too. And don't get me wrong, I believe that Jesus changes us from the inside out and that the Spirit of God gives us the strength and the discernment that we need to live according to his will. But I still think that we have to be so aware of the danger that control often disguises itself as comfort. And far too often, we like to control things according to our own desires because we want to live comfortable and pain-free lives. However, if we look at Jesus, the one who's been where we are, we would see that sometimes surrender is painful. And tonight we're going to look at Luke chapter 22. And in this chapter, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's preparing to be arrested and then crucified. And he goes to the garden with his disciples. And picking up in verse 41, it says, "He withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." In this moment, Jesus knew that he was about to surrender his life, and that in doing so, he would have to experience this satisfied wrath of God. And it was agonizing to him. In fact, I believe that in this moment, surrender went against the human nature of Jesus. Because we know that Jesus was fully God, but also fully man, and I believe that his human nature was not looking forward to surrender, which is why the Lord sent an angel to strengthen him, but it's also why it caused him so much pain. And just recently, I was talking to my counselor, and she told me that there's studies done on the human brain and human behavior that show physical, emotional, and mental turmoil when it comes to surrender, because most of us don't know how to say goodbye. And I believe that there might be something in your life tonight that you don't know how to say goodbye to, and that laying it at the feet of Jesus would seriously pain you. Maybe it's a relationship, a job, a sport, or a season of life. But the idea of it slipping through your fingers causes your chest to physically ache. And that's because surrender isn't natural. Which leads me to my second point tonight, that surrender is a choice. And when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, we actually see Jesus do something pretty remarkable, actually, that shows us that Jesus wasn't forced to surrender. And it's the same story that we were reading earlier about Jesus being in the garden. It's just from the Gospel of Matthew this time. And when we look at this story, we see that when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, his disciples get angry and start to fight back. And we see Peter actually get up and cut off the ear of another Roman soldier. And in this moment, instead of being like, "Fight for me, yes, thank you," which I'm pretty sure if all of us were about to be arrested for something we didn't do, we'd be standing there like, "No, don't take me. Like, get all my friends and fight for me, please. Like, I don't want to go." Like, instead, Jesus comes up and he says, "Peter, put down the sword." And in verse 53, he says, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels?" And I think we read over this pretty quickly. And as I was studying, I recognized something Because there's something so fascinating about what Jesus says when he makes the comment about 12 legions of angels. In fact, if we were to look back at 2 Kings, we would see a story where one angel is responsible for killing 185,000 soldiers. And during this time period, a legion was a term used to describe a group of soldiers that consisted of about 6,000 men. So do the math, 12 legions of angels would be about 72,000 angels. And if one angel can kill 185,000 soldiers, then 72,000 angels could be responsible for killing 13 billion soldiers. And that seems crazy, right? I'm sure in the garden, there wasn't 13 billion soldiers coming to arrest Jesus. And what Jesus says here might sound belittling, but I believe that in this moment, Jesus wanted everyone listening to understand so clearly that these men could not arrest him against his will, and that he would go with them by his own choice, because he was submitting to the will of the Father. And when it comes to living a life surrendered, the example that Jesus shows us is that sometimes surrender hurts. And it's also that surrender is something we choose. And I don't know about you guys, but that just leaves me with the question of how. How did he do it? I know he was fully God, but he was also fully man, and he was giving up his life. How did he choose to surrender? And I believe that Jesus was able to choose surrender because he had a proper view of the Father. You see, Jesus' relationship with the Father was personal and intimate. And from the very beginning of his ministry, he was leaving the crowds. And he was going to the mountainside to pray and be alone. Over and over again, Jesus was training himself to recognize, rely on, and trust the character of the Father. And learning to trust someone takes time. We know that. And oftentimes we do it anyways because we know that it's worth it. And I just want to share a time with you in my life, really quick. I used to cheer competitively. I started when I was 7 years old. I ended when I was 18. And I was a flyer. I was 4 feet tall until I was a freshman in high school. So I used to just get chucked around. And it was a lot of fun. I loved cheer. We used to travel, and we would just travel around the country. And one time we had a competition that was in Chicago, and we went to warm-ups. And just a little backstory with competitive cheer, you go to warm-ups, and it leads to directly going behind stage and then getting on stage and performing. We have the same groups, same stunt groups all year, so it's the same people underneath me, and it's the same routine all year long. And so we're in warm-ups, and my bass wasn't there. And I'm like, where is she? And we come to find out that she was stuck in traffic in Chicago. And I'm like, this is great. I don't have a bass. So we're hopefully she comes and gets here on time. And I'm in I'm in warm-ups. We get all the way through warm-ups, and she's not there. At this point, they come over and they grab some person from another gym, or the same gym in a different location, and they're trying to teach them. And I'm like, I'm going to have to just go with it. I don't even know this girl. We're going to fall. I'm going to fall on my face. I'm going to be so embarrassed. My team's going to be let down. And right before we go on stage, my bass shows up, and she runs backstage. She gives me a hug, and she's like, we're doing it. And we go on stage, and that was the first time that day that I got to practice my stunt, and I was so scared. But we did well, and we hit our stunts, and we did the routine beautifully, and we ended up winning that competition. And it was crazy to me. And coming out of that moment, I believe that we were able to be successful because even though we didn't get time that day to prepare ourselves, we went into the competition already knowing and trusting each other. I trusted her to be underneath me. I knew that we could do it. And in the same way, I believe that Jesus did not gain the strength to surrender once he was in the garden, but rather he walked into the garden already prepared, because he had spent his entire life getting a clearer view of who he was surrendering to. Jesus was ready for battle, because when it came time for him to surrender, the thing that mattered the most wasn't what he was losing control of, but who he was giving control to. And he knew exactly who that was. The last thing I have for you guys tonight on how I think Jesus was able to surrender is that he turned away from his own desire and he took on a readiness for God's will. We read earlier that the first thing Jesus did before choosing surrender in the garden was get on his knees in prayer. And at this moment in Luke 22, verse 42, Jesus says, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." He made it clear right there in the garden on his knees that his desire was not to go to the cross. The human nature of who Jesus was so afraid to bear the wrath of God, yet he laid it out and he laid himself in the dirt and he got ready for whatever it was that God wanted him to do. And I believe that so many of us in the room think that we're living a surrendered life. And I just want to ask you guys, when was the last time that you got on your knees and said, "Not my will, but your will be done"? And some of you guys have a relationship in your life that you couldn't bear to lose. And you're not sure if it's healthy, and you don't know if it's pleasing. And some of you are on the verge of making a college decision, and you don't want to go far from home, but you hear this still small voice urging you to. And some of you are battling sin struggles that you secretly enjoy, and you're crossing boundaries that you know shouldn't be crossed. And some of you are playing a sport, and it's simply wearing you out. Some of you are striving for popularity and good grades and an image and friendships, and you're sacrificing your spiritual health to do it. And I just want to ask, when was the last time you got on your knees and you said, "God, have your way. Jesus, not my will, but yours be done"? Because you guys, the truth is that control is comfortable and it makes room for what we want. But surrender, it makes room for what we really need. In the story of Matthew, when Peter cuts off the soldier's ear, we see that Peter was so focused on defending his friend because he didn't want Jesus to die. But we see in the end that Jesus' act of surrender actually led him to the cross. And that what Peter didn't need was a friend. What Peter needed was salvation. And surrender made room for that. It made room for what he needed. I had a mentor in my life once tell me, "Hands open, eyes on Jesus." And I think that Jesus himself sets the example that that's what surrender should look like. Because sometimes we have our hands open and we put our hands up in the air in worship and it hurts us because we know that we are leaving something behind. But what we're moving to is the thing that we actually need. And at the end of the day, I believe that Jesus is so worthy of your surrender. And Jesus is worthy of your surrender because before you had to surrender a thing, he surrendered his life for you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, we come to you tonight in awe of who you are and in all of what you've done. God, you went to the cross so that we didn't have to. God, it was hard for you. It hurt for you. It hurt you. And God, that should have been our place. And we are so thankful that you bore a wrath that we could never have borne on our own, God. We're thankful that you have the final say, that you give us life. And God, that you give us the opportunity to surrender so that you can do a work in us that gives us what we really need. In a world where things are so hard and heavy and the idea of surrender goes against our flesh, God, I ask that you would give us the strength to do it. God, that we would be a people who go out into the world knowing you, having a proper view of who you are, and leaning in to the work that you've done. God, we love you. We're so thankful for you. And it's in your name we pray.